The objective here again is Action Accelerator. And so it is, what are the takeaways based upon what you've heard and the lifetime of experience you put in to get to this table? What it is we ought to be doing the next 6 months, the next 12 months, the next 24 months.
Well, thank you all for coming in, for everyone viewing on Zoom. And thank you, Jim and Kenan, for putting this together, Competitive Wisconsin. So I think from my view and the lens that I approach this is really to listen to what a lot of my friends here said. Again, as the Economic Development Organization, I think my takeaways from this would be a couple of things. There are 3 things that I think where we could look at if we want to move the needle on this thing. Number 1 would be the education. And that's education to the community and education to elected officials and government officials at every level. And granted, it's more easier said than done, but I don't think I think we're at a point where we have to do that. So that education about where we want to go in transportation, what will that entail? And quite honestly, address, as the Secretary said, some myths about transportation. Former background, I think Steve said it, Rob said it best. There are some legislative issues that I think we could potentially take away from this. What we've been hearing when we talk to a number of municipalities and government and the economic development professionals in all 8 counties is the TIF ability. And I'm not saying this should be something, but there should be some discussion on what do we do with TIF. And the reason why I say that is because over the last several months, I've sat with international companies who want to come and expand here, but we're TIF'd out. And so what happens is, for example, and again, I think this goes to some of Dennis's point, when we talk about attraction and how all this feeds into this transportation system or ecosystem, we had a company that was literally, and I think I may have talked to you about it, we had a company that was literally looking to expand here, 200-something engineers. When you start crunching the numbers, you don't have to be a physicist to figure out, just do the math. The economic benefit and the return on investment from a company that's going to attract and grow 200-something engineers to our region, that's just more money in the pot. But came to the legislature, and look, I love the guy, but I'm going to say his name anyway. Representative Dewey Strobel shot it down. And this is to Dewey, there's a rule in legislator business, you don't crap on other people's territory. If it's not your district, you don't make rules and decisions based on other people's district. So what happens is we have to, as Steve said, play these games. And now from an economic practitioner point of view, I'm looking at us lose out on 200 potential engineers. I'm looking at the economic loss that created. I'm looking at opportunity costs that we miss out on when these things occur. And again, it's not just Dewey's fault. I mean, Dewey was being responsible in his eyes, and I get it. But from a legislative point of view, we have to have a strategy, an idea of where do we want to go? You have to have a game plan as to where are we going in Wisconsin? What is the strategy to compete against a Boston or Austin? And all these things are on the table, which is why I think if you hear a lot of my friends here, I'm touching base with a lot of them. Rick and I are working on Pastor Road. Nothing is off the table. So the political and policy initiatives. And then finally, I think, we have to deal with we got to get good people in the room who know how to work together. I'll be remiss if I don't say this, and then I'll shut up and pass it on. If you had everybody in this room working on this issue, we'd get something done, without question. I think we all know it. If you had everybody in this room working on something, we'd be able to come to some conclusion if we really need to move forward. The strategy, where are we going? How are we going to compete globally? We need to educate our elected officials and our communities, and then let's look at the policy and funding mechanisms and see where those need work.
Well, I'm going to say something nice about the legislature and about government and about the officials, because I do remember working with them, and I still do. But Jason is right. in terms of the challenges and the polarization in that. But I think one of the things we need to do as we address these issues and these challenges is be optimistic. Is, you know, it may come as news to some people in the room and some people on the video that, you know, the legislature, Robin Vos, Evan Lemahieu, are not exactly on Governor Evers' Christmas card list, and they, you know, and vice versa. But in the last budget, we saw significant funding increases in this critical area, transportation and transportation funding. Now, they disagreed, and this is how the, you know, Jason, you know this because you were great at it. This is how the process should work. The governor acknowledged the need for additional funding. The legislature didn't like where he was getting the money. They sat down, and the legislature worked with the industry, with the, and said, how about we fund it differently, but we get you the funding. And what do you know? At the end of the day, there's a funding increase, the ball moves down the field. And so I think, you know, we do need to acknowledge the governor's leadership there. We do need to acknowledge the legislative leadership's role there, moving it down, putting a budget on his desk that he could sign. And so there is reason for optimism there. I think another reason for optimism is, you know, whether you like it or not, there are going to be pretty secure majorities that come back in the legislature, in both the Senate and the Assembly, and they're going to be big enough that nobody's going to have to worry about one person flipping the vote on a budget amendment or on a policy issue. And so I think there's a little more wiggle room for broader discussion than sometimes there are when there are narrower or more polarized majorities. And I think that holds regardless of who wins the governor's race. And the third thing I would say, and I will wrap with this, is we've got an opportunity in this area because traditionally and even today, to a large extent, transportation is Switzerland politically. I mean, there's a lot of polarization over a lot of things, but at the end of the day, Republicans, Democrats, liberals, conservatives, they all understand the importance of transportation, of infrastructure, and some of them look at it in different ways, and some of them take it from different angles, but none of them are like, well, government shouldn't be involved in that. No, there's a shared understanding, and no pun intended here, it's a concrete issue to the public and to legislators because they can see it, they feel it, they experience it every day. You know, it's not some abstract thing. It's the road, the safe road that your kids take into school. It's the highway that you're driving to work on. It's a real concrete thing. And so I think we have an issue area here, and perhaps a political dynamic here that sets up for some more cooperation than sometimes we allow our frustration to acknowledge. Because it is, you know, we are all aspirational. And in some ways, your reach should always, you know, exceed your grasp. Otherwise, what is heaven for? But we can get hung up on the things that we didn't get. Sometimes we got to stand back and go, okay, we moved the ball down the field. Let's take the win we can and keep moving it down the field. And I'm kind of optimistic about that. And I think as we move forward, discussions like this are important parts of it. Discussions with our legislatures are important parts about it. And discussions that don't pigeonhole people or polarize them. And again, I think we're in a pretty advantageous position for that because we start from a position where people understand the importance of transportation. Now, working the details down from that, it can get a little hairy, but I think we start from a pretty good position, and we need to keep that optimism in our work.
If I could, Jim, if I could add on to that, 6 months, 12 months, long term, I'm really glad that Steve said that and took that tack because I was going to agree with that. You know, 6 months you'd think it would be the very small, low-hanging fruit, and then 12 months. I think in the 6 months we can get some big things done, which I want to talk about. And I agree. I think it's building upon, you know, we talked about we went a long time without getting a revenue increase passed, but we did under split control of the legislature. And the way Steve described it's absolutely right. Both entities should take credit for that. So within the next 6 months, And I want to, Bill, I really appreciate some of the things Rick said today, and I hadn't touched upon this yet, but I'm going to talk about first about passenger rail. Within the next 6 months, twice daily round trips from Twin Cities to Milwaukee to Chicago, brand new. It's going to happen. We worked with Minnesota. We got the grant funding. It's going to be Amtrak. It's going to go along the Empire Route, but brand new twice daily service, Twin Cities, Milwaukee, Chicago. That's a big deal. The passenger rail between the Milwaukee to Chicago, Hiawatha, which 7 round trips a day, as Rick had pointed out, one of the most successful in the country. We're going to expand those daily. So that's within the next 6 months. I believe within the next 6 months we can get a budget that diversifies the fund like we talked about. I believe that could be introduced and even either passed or passed close to that amount of time. I think that's reasonable to think we can do in the next 6 months. Within the next 12 months, I think we start talking about some of the bigger picture about having, even beyond that, the longer term, embracing the technology more, looking at the technology more. But I think we can do some really big things in the next 6 months because, some of the things that were brought up, again, I appreciate Southern Bridge. That's, I wouldn't say it's a done deal, but we've gotten a long way there. I-41 that was talked about, that's been enumerated. The east-west that we talked about, we're a long way down that road that we've done. So we've talked about some of these things like they're intractable problems, but we've made a lot of headway on these, and I think we can do a lot more in the next 6 months.
It comes back to people is what I'm taking away from today. We need more people here. And we need more people here to do the jobs, but we need more people here to pay sales tax, gas tax, property tax to fund what we need to do. So it's pretty basic stuff. And where do people want to be? When I look at, I've got 4 kids, one oldest 18, next oldest 16. They're not all that interested in driving. I couldn't wait to drive when I was a kid. What they're more interested in is communities that can offer them options when it comes to transportation and transit, et cetera. And so I'm really glad to hear about the passenger rail element come up into the discussion here. And it's not just passenger rail for the, Milwaukee, Madison, and that's a great point the Secretary made with the new line that's going to start running to the Twin Cities. We need to talk about passenger rail in Green Bay, the Fox Valley, other parts of the state. We are losing people to places like Boston and Austin, you talked about, because this is a great place to live, and some of that could be climate when you think of Austin, but not Boston. It's because, you go to Boston, and it's not hard to get around. It's actually quite easy to get around that town. And the next generation that is coming up wants more options, and we need to understand that and give them more options when it comes to transportation. I keep coming back to, if you build it, they will come. We need to make investments in our infrastructure, roads and bridges, absolutely, but the rest of it. And I also keep coming back to, we are going to continue to see declining populations in rural Wisconsin, which affects the school districts, which you start losing your schools, you start losing your Main Street. It's a domino effect. We need to keep pushing forward with this broadband infrastructure and potentially look at some incentives for businesses that will be willing to locate in different parts of the state that maybe haven't been historically looked at. But to do that, they need the infrastructure, broadband, roads, et cetera, and they need the people. People's first and foremost, but they aren't going to stay and they aren't going to come if we don't have that infrastructure.
Some of you know I spent a good deal of my life in crisis management. And one of the rules of crisis management is always find the smartest people in the room first, okay? Today was an example of what happens when you find the smartest people in the room and ask them to talk to you. This has been an enlightening and useful conversation from my vantage point. Can't tell you how much I appreciate it. Also in communications, there's an old, the old thing, you got to see it to believe it. In communications, it's the other way around. You have to believe it to see it, okay? Think about that for a minute, because it's what drives our current national politics. At the local level, there is less of that. There are people gathering around opportunity and need and capacity. And that's what meetings like this, I hope, are about. So my takeaway is what I heard today and in all the lead up to it, I see 3 big blocks you got to deal with. One is urgency, One is adequacy and appropriateness, and the third is collaboration. Under the urgency, I would rank it in terms of public safety, economic growth, and long-term planning, sequenced in that fashion. Under adequacy and appropriateness, again, urgency first, alignment probably second in terms of have we got the needs lined up with the workforce, with the opportunities, et cetera, and costs, okay? Because I don't think we've got that all sorted out yet, and particularly with inflation coming at us. On the collaboration side of it, I think it's essentially four things. I think it is, and really you saw pieces of it here today, it is the capacity to reimagine synergies of the moment, okay? To think about how different pieces might come together, whether it's the idea that you could actually use general purpose revenue as opposed to simply using a gas tax, et cetera. Secondly, it's coordination. Third, it is skill sharing. And fourth, it is support. Who pays for this? How do you put these pieces together?
Okay. First, let me just thank Competitive Wisconsin for facilitating this conversation on one of the most important challenges facing us today in this state. One thing I heard, one thing I really didn't hear, and then an observation. One thing I heard, counties have all the answers. I think we can all agree on that. And maybe I'm the one that said it, but nonetheless it was stated. So in any event, one thing I didn't hear though, except for a couple indirect references, we really didn't have any conversation today about partisan politics. Why? Because transportation and infrastructure is not a partisan issue. If you care about the future of this state, partisan politics really isn't part of the conversation. And that's encouraging. We have one of the strongest advocates for transportation ever in the history of our state in the Speaker of the Assembly, in Robin Vos. We have a governor who's very interested in the future of our state and understands clearly that transportation is a big part of that. So I'm really happy to hear we really don't have a partisan issue. We have an actual future of Wisconsin issue. And speaking of the future of Wisconsin, what I'm really encouraged about, if we want to affect what our future looks like in 20 years, our tradition has been in this nation to start thinking about it in 18 years. But the reality is, Dale Knapp, and I'll put the other smartest person in this state on the same level as Dale, Dennis Winters, if you want to know what the future looks like, you can ask either one of these two gentlemen, and they'll tell us what we're going to look like in 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And if you like what they have to say, then we should do exactly what we're doing now. But if you don't like the future they describe to us, the time to start acting on that is not in 18 years or 28 years, it is today. So what we need is vision and futurists and putting ourselves in the future to determine what future we can create for ourselves as opposed to the one that we have to react to because of circumstances we could have controlled. And I'm really, really encouraged by that. We got a real opportunity here, and the sooner we grasp and understand clearly the role that transportation and infrastructure has in the success of this state, the sooner we can get on with the business of addressing it to position ourselves for future success.